Got it.
All right. Hi, Diane. Ellie, I love your background. Are those the significant environmental emitters?
You're muted, Ellie. We can't get the text.
I just want everybody to know those are the Newton gas leaks.
Yeah,
Oh,
One. Yeah,
that's discouraging.
hundreds and hundreds of them.
Yeah.
What a waste. Yeah.
so I guess when we begin, people should be muted if they're not the speaker. Is that how we're going to do it?
Yeah, thanks. Let me,
Is that how we're going to do it?
Tracy, did you see
Okay.
Anne's message in the chat?
Oh, no. Okay.
Do you want to make Anne co-host?
Yeah.
Since she's very familiar with the hosting platform.
Yeah.
Judah. Like,
And are we wanting to start at the top of the hour? It's
All right.
7 o'clock now. So just let me know.
A lot of people are coming in, so I think we should give it a few minutes.
Sounds good.
One thing about Zoom participants list is that one of the few times people at the bottom of the alphabet, like me with a W, get to be at the top of the list.
How about we start in a minute? That makes sense?
sure.
Give me a thumbs up.
Can just.
Have to prove that with the intent bill series of council. That's not the case. What was useless to
I don't know. I don't know.
Tracy, ask people to mute.
Yeah. Okay, I've learned how to do that. Hi,
I
Jeff.
want to, ready to go? Yes.
Yeah.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Ruth Kaplan, one of the 3 co-chairs of Mass Public Banking, along with Nancy Ryan on the call with us this evening, and Nia Evans, who's the executive director of the Boston Ujima Project. Before I go on, if people can mute their phones, that would be very helpful. And also be sure to put your questions in the chat, okay? And we'll be getting to them. So thanks for doing that. Tax day is coming up soon. Do you ever wonder where the state deposits our tax dollars? Today, most of the state's funds are deposited in a private investment fund, which invests around the world. We're here now to say that the state should deposit some of its revenues in our own state bank, which can then make loans to help our communities and especially help address the racial and gender inequity in lending and the need to take proactive measures to address the looming climate crisis. And this is just what the legislation to create the Mass Public Bank is all about. And we're not alone. The 2008 financial crisis wakened activists across the country to the need for an alternative to Wall Street banks. Looking at the success of the 100-year-old bank in, would you believe it, North Dakota, activists started organizing to get money out of the Wall Street banks, and a national movement to create public banks was born. I've been part of that movement since it first began, first in Washington, D.C., and now up here in Boston and Massachusetts. Today, Massachusetts is part of a movement stretching from Philadelphia to California, where steps are being taken to establish public banks. In fact, the Philadelphia City Council has just recently passed a bill almost unanimously to put the creation of a public bank in motion. And California has passed a state law setting up a process for regions to create public banks across the state. And now Alameda County in Northern California and San Francisco are both well along in this process of creating their own regional public banks. Here in Massachusetts, we have a robust coalition, including Mothers Out Front, so thanks guys for hosting this, and Sierra Club, as well as the Black Economic Council of Massachusetts, BECMA, the Boston Ujima Project, and many, many others. If you go to our website, masspublicbanking.org, you'll see on the homepage all the organizations that are already supporting the public bank, ranging from the Boston Foundation to a local enterprise, the Commonwealth Kitchen, from the Metro Mayors Coalition, which includes the city of Boston, to Boston Leaf, the Local Enterprise Assistance Fund, which is a CDFI, a kind of public interest lender. We've also greatly benefited from the financial and banking expertise of professors and practitioners in the field, several of whom are with us on the call this evening to explain more about how the public bank will work. So legislation to create the public bank is before the Joint Committee on Financial Services, which has extended its deadline for considering our bills from the formal February 2nd deadline for all bills to April 30th. This in itself was an important achievement for us. Now these next few weeks are key for our legislators to hear our voices. So again, thanks to everyone who's come on this call. Now, next week, April 11th to 15th, is Public Banking Week, and we'll be mobilizing with you and all our partners for a tsunami of calls to our legislators. But right now, you can use the form, which should be on your screen, to quickly send a message to your senator and representative. It's just a click away. It's up there, right? I'm just checking. Is our form-
Not yet.
Okay, it'll be up there very, very soon. So watch for it. We're really delighted to be partnering with Mothers Out Front and Sierra Club and have all of you join this evening. As you well know from all the advocacy that you do, it's critically important that legislators hear from their constituents directly. We're very pleased to have Olivia Fisher Fox with Mothers Out Front and Justin Higian with Sierra Club, both with us this evening. They'll each say a few words about their organization and why they support the Mass Public Bank. Olivia is the chapter co-coordinator for Mothers Out Front Brookline, which looks at the climate crisis through the lens of systemic racism. And Jess is the political and legislative coordinator for Sierra Club Massachusetts, which clearly understands that climate justice and racial justice are closely linked. Olivia, let's start with you. Tell us about Mothers Out Front and why you're supporting the Massachusetts Public Bank.
Oh, thank you, Ruth. Well, often the best ideas are formed at the kitchen table, and that's exactly how this webinar came to be. While having a cup of tea with Chris Desan, I was describing some of the challenges we're facing at Mothers Out Front and Brookline Town Meeting around resources, equity, and climate change. Chris, in turn, described her work reviving the idea of a public bank. to meet the needs of underserved communities, including financing for climate. I said, Chris, we need to shine a little light on this idea. When I consulted Tracy Burns, a Brookline Mothers Out Front fearless leader with a banking background, she said, this is banking for the public good. It's exactly what Mothers Out Front stands for. I'm super excited about a public bank. We are thrilled to be co-sponsoring with the Sierra Club and Ujima, who walk alongside us in our efforts. And I'm delighted that you have made time this evening to join us. So welcome, and welcome Jess Nahigian from the Sierra Club. Maybe she'd like to follow up.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jess Nahigian. As was said, I'm the political and legislative coordinator from the Sierra Club. And at the Sierra Club, we're really thinking about how we can, our mission really is to explore, to enjoy, and to protect the planet. And we understand, just like Ruth said, that protecting the planet is not only about the environment, because the environment is so closely linked with all of the other parts of our society. And that includes economic justice and racial justice. You know, as a person working for the Sierra Club, I'm often talking with legislators and members of the public about the need for a transition over to clean energy and a clean energy future. And, you know, this is the clean energy future that it's not just a nice to have, it's what the science says absolutely needs to happen if we are to avoid catastrophic effects of climate change. And I oftentimes hear people ask me, you know, well, that sounds really great, but how are you going to pay for it? I think probably anybody here who's advocated in the environmental space has heard that before, because it's true. Changing business as usual can be challenging and it can be expensive. And what we are really excited about in this proposal is that a public bank really reimagines what funding this transition might look like. Because a public bank doesn't just provide money for one particular project or one particular, you know, type of energy. It helps projects across all sectors to meet their environmental and sustainability goals. So, and what's more, it's this bill, as you'll hear later, is specifically designed to target the communities that need that investment the most. And through this method of financing, we can integrate sustainability into all of the money that we're investing into these communities. Instead of having these separate pots of money in different programs, different places, we can think about it holistically. And really, that's what we need to do when we think about environmental issues. We need to think about this holistically, because it's not something that's just tied to the environmental sector. Like I said, it's connected to economic justice and racial justice. So, you know, we're just really excited by this public bank bill, and we believe that it can take the first steps towards funding the energy transition that we need and the climate transition we need, while also embodying the regenerative economic system that we need to move towards if we're going to change business as usual.
Ruth, you're muted. Ruth, you're
Oh.
muted.
Sorry, thanks, Jess. It's really good to have Sierra Club as a partner in this project. I've been a Sierra Club member for many, many decades, so I'm especially pleased about your participating in this. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Harvard Law professor Krista Sand, who combines a deep understanding of the money and banking systems with incredible patience and clarity as she helps us wrap our minds around how these complex systems work. Not only has Chris given very generously of her time and expertise in helping to ensure that our proposal for a public bank is well-grounded, she's also inspired some of her law students to give of their time and talent in doing key research around the public bank. Chris will share with us the basics about the public bank and how it'll help Massachusetts address looming threat of climate change. Thanks so much, Chris, for being with us this evening.
Thank you. Well, it's a great honor to speak with you. And I thought I would start by introducing the public bank in relation to the essential need that you have rightly prioritized. That is, we see the urgency of the moment just by reminding ourselves of the depth of our problem. So today, the Earth is hotter than it has been in the 12,000 years of human civilization. There's a third more carbon in the atmosphere than there has been in the last 800,000 years. We are adding carbon to the atmosphere at a rate faster than the latest grand extinction event, at least perhaps 10 times faster, according to recent calculations. That event, you all know this better than I do, the end Permian extinction resulted from events that eerily parallel where we are today. So a buildup of carbon dioxide, a warm up that accelerates the triggering of methane's release, that change itself leading to widespread extinctions. The UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said that putting a ceiling on rising temperatures is essential, that the difference in a half a degree of warming is the difference in 150 million lives. The same agency reported that we could have a temperature rise as much as 4.4 degrees by 2100. The damages to property and businesses alone in the coming years will be extensive. Weather-related damage in coastal regions like Massachusetts currently exposes real estate to flooding and rising ocean damage that is estimated to amount to $1 trillion. I say this because it makes clear that this is an all hands on deck moment, and yet the Commonwealth is currently leaving money on the table. It has financial capacity currently unused that it could level against problems caused by climate change, by this kind of exigency. That capacity is the ability to act as a bank. So I'm going to talk about the power of banks for just a moment, their potency, and then the way we can harness that potency as a public. First, to the potency of banks. Banking brings powerful capacity to a lender. Banks can lend at lower rates than any other financiers because they provide the money supply in modern society. So the Olivia's T, this is what we talked about. One of the many things we talked about is sort of the mechanics of how banks do that. The deposits they hold, the deposits that all of us leave in banks, tie banks into a network of existing savings and wealth. And that network allows them to create money through extending new credit, new promises of money. That credit, those promises of money made by banks, then do the work of money. As a result, banks can take a sum of capital and lend 8 to 10 times as much, an enormous amount of leverage. They can lend, therefore, for lesser rates, and they can reach further than other lenders, often at costs that are more than 4% lower than other lenders. That's a powerful business model. Commercial banks, however, deploy their models as profit-driven. That's what they are designed to do. After all, they have to respond to their shareholders. Their lending leaves aside all kinds of borrowers, many kinds of innovation, many underserved communities that don't have conventional capital, collateral, or credit histories, many cities and towns that have longer term needs for financing than banks want to finance. Enter a public bank. The public, in the form of a bank, could use the same powerful business model. In fact, publics actually charter banks and therefore empower banks to act this way. So the public bank is simply a return to a 19th century pattern, which the Bank of North Dakota still carries on, to empower the public itself to act with greater reach, banking reach. And the public, of course, would lend with a far greater and greener reach than banks do. It could take, using the same business model, the public could take a sum of capital and lend 8 to 10 times as much. it could do that kind of lending effectively. Indeed, according to all of our calculations, a public bank could lend at rates even lower than a commercial bank. That's because it would have lower operating costs. It would have one depositor, the state. It would work through other conduits, as I'm about to mention. Commercial banks and community development finance institutions would partner with the bank, and it would not have profit-oriented shareholders. That's potent, right? That's the kind of capacity that the public bank would bring. But while it would have that kind of power, that potency, it would also lend differently. It would lend with a reach that is public, not constricted by the parameters that drive commercial banks. I'm just going to give one example in the interest of time, one that puts the social justice character of a public bank doing environmental work up front. Underserved communities have been disproportionately impacted by climate change. They're situated often in locations exposed to rising sea levels. They're situated in places exposed to toxic efflux from climate change, from industries affected by climate change, or they're suffering from food insecurity. A public bank could support businesses designed to respond to such challenges, including the installation of clean energy technology in lower income communities, home repair, indeed the support of sustainable agriculture, and small food businesses, restaurants, markets, that kind of business. The public bank legislation directs lending to just those borrowers who fall through the cracks. So the eligible recipients are listed in the bill, and they pick up the kinds of borrowers that commercial banks don't normally reach. In addition, the public bank bill states priorities for financing, including borrowers from underserved communities and the small businesses that serve those communities, the community development finance institutions that serve those communities, cities and towns, and in fact, specifically climate-related work. So one of the many priorities is entities that address the impacts of climate change and the reduction of greenhouse gases. So far as possible, as I mentioned, these kinds of loans would be done through existing banks and community development finance institutions when they can lend. So the point here is not to compete with commercial banks or community development finance institutions. It's to harness them and to allow them to reach borrowers they wouldn't normally work with. The last point I'll make here is just on the logistics. The proposed bank is extremely feasible and entirely accountable to the public. It's a relatively small bank that the bill proposes. The bank would be capitalized with 200 million public funds, right? An investment by the state, an appropriation. So this is a pilot program in the Massachusetts, budget. That's a relatively small amount. It's not a high-risk endeavor. As for deposits, that capital, 200 million, would allow the bank to carry assets of 1.6 billion. As for deposits, no new money would be needed. The state would simply transfer a portion of existing revenues, about that 1.6 billion, currently held out of state, as Ruth mentioned, in the Mass Municipal Deposit Trust, to the public bank. And that those out-of-state holdings are yet another reason for this group to act. So from 2016 to 2018, 6 of the 8 largest US bank holding companies, the type who furnish the investment accounts in which the state holds its money, 6 of those 8 largest banks financed over 700 billion gave 700 billion financing to fossil fuel companies. That is, those banks accounted for 37% of global fossil fuel finance since the Paris Agreement was adopted. Our state money should not be contributing to that kind of development. It's going the wrong direction. On the positive side, when that money came home, it would, as I said, finance 1.6 billion in good affirmative lending, assuming a very cautious leverage ratio. The bank would make about $1.5 billion of loans. Finally, the bank would be accountable. The legislation is structured around strong governance provisions that provide for public input and an expert direction. And here I wanted to mention again, the bill prioritizes climate change by way of its board of advisors who have a strong role in bank direction. And there are 4 dedicated slots that are relevant to us today. Representatives from, and here I'm just reading from the bill, climate change amelioration and environmental finance is one category, each a dedicated slot. Sustainable agriculture, another category, another representative food security, another representative environmental justice. In other words, 1/4 of the 16 community members of the Board of Advisors are directly tied to environmental justice concerns and environmental health more generally. To wrap back to the beginning, I would just end by saying we do indeed face an existential moment and we need to respond with creativity and commitment. The public bank is a powerful way to do so, both for the work it would do and for the message it would send that it's no longer business as usual. We have to move now. We have to make a difference now. We have to use the capacity that we have. Thank you.
And Chris, will you introduce Michael Swack?
I would be happy to. Michael Swack will speak next. He's one of the experts that has enormously strengthened this initiative and helped write the bill. He's the director of the Carsey Center of Public Policy at the University of New Hampshire and an expert in community development and in community development finance.
Thank you, Chris. And thanks for the invitation. It's good to be here. Remember when that used to mean that it was good to be in a specific place? I say good to be here and actually it's good to be in my son's bedroom here, I guess is where I am. So, at any rate, I want to talk just briefly about clean energy financing and the role of the public bank. I want to preface that by saying it's been great over the past year working with Ruth and Nancy and Chris and others to see the incredible enthusiasm that's been generated for the bank. And we're hoping it gets to the stage where the legislation passes and the bank becomes a reality and that energy enthusiasm is sustained, because the bank has a lot of possibilities, but its ability to do the things we're talking about really depend on the kind of energy that's brought by the people here today. The natural urge of any bank, whether it's a public bank or a private bank, is to be risk averse. And really one of the goals of this public bank is to try and promote risk taking, at least in the way that mainstream financial institutions aren't willing to take that risk. So how can that happen? Well, in clean energy financing, in some ways, it's like financing for housing. What you really want is to be able to find long-term, fixed rate, low interest financing to finance, for example, things like solar installations in households and community centers in low and moderate income communities. It's not a big issue in wealthier communities in many ways, because people in wealthy communities have access to financing, and people in wealthy communities have access to the tax code, which helps facilitate financing and makes solar energy more affordable. Those affordability features don't always help low and moderate income communities. So how can a public bank, for example, support solar and low income communities? Well, first through creative partnerships through community lenders, which are many community lenders are beginning to originate and figure out how to do solar lending in poorer communities. And these community lenders, a group of them are community development financial institutions. Massachusetts has 28 of these community development financial institutions. And these institutions are really the capillaries of the financial system. These are the ones that actually deliver down at the grassroots level to borrowers who don't have access to mainstream financing. So how does it work? Well, the bank can work with these community development lenders as sort of transaction enablers That is, they can do things like buy down interest rates. They can help fund loss reserves. They can have warehousing facilities, meaning they can buy loans originated by these lenders and provide more capital for these capillaries to do more lending. They can also be creative, and this is where an advisory board and a board has to challenge management. In Connecticut, for example, there's a really interesting program that's started in Connecticut, now spreading to several other states. We're working with a group called Inclusive Prosperity Capital, which has developed a platform and a product called Smart E. And Smart E is a collaboration between the Connecticut Green Bank, Capital for Change, a community development financial institution, and Inclusive Prosperity Capital, a nonprofit. And what it does is it pulls together, it standardizes a way that a loan can be made. So the Green Bank can provide lending to Inclusive Prosperity Capital. And Inclusive Prosperity Capital then has an operating platform where they work with lenders like CDFIs and developers and installers, sort of a turnkey all-in-one that makes financing, installation, and access to approved developers available to do installations in communities not otherwise served. And they're able to do this because they're able to offer terms like $0 down, low fixed interest rates that would be available through a public bank, longer term payments, for example, 10 to 15 years. Again, a public bank is in a position to make long-term capital available to these intermediaries. So that's just an example of how a bank can be creative, and in being creative can help originate loans like solar loans and other environmentally sensitive loans that mainstream financial institutions still struggle to do. So Ruth, I'm going to turn it back to you, I think.
Yeah. Thanks, Michael. That was terrific to hear from you. And you have been just such an amazing help in all of our work. So a big shout out and thanks. We were very sad to learn just a few hours ago that Paige Curtis, who's the Culture and Communications Director for the Boston Ujima Project, who was scheduled to speak this evening about our environmental justice agenda, has just come down with COVID, and she's actually not well enough to speak tonight. So I'm going to say a few words about how the need for racial justice in financing is a central concern in advocating for the Mass Public Bank, and in how the public bank will actually make its loans. The Boston Foundation, in a report, The Color of the Capital Gap, published last year, documented the racial gaps in access to financing and endorsed the public bank as a key tool for addressing this gap. That was a big boost for us to have that support from the Boston Foundation. For those of you not in Massachusetts, it's probably our largest private foundation in the state. Mass Public Banking has also laid out the problem very clearly in our written testimony, which we submitted to the Joint Committee on Financial Services last November. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just read to you from our testimony. It'll give you a flavor of our testimony and actually show you how clearly people like Michael and Chris and others have laid these things out. So the problem, a structural shortfall, has left deserving borrowers starved of credit and capital. That's the header. Communities of color have long had unequal access to credit and capital. Black, brown, immigrant, indigenous, and women-owned businesses have long faced unequal access to credit because of discriminatory practices. The combined forces of current racial discrimination and generational disparities in personal and family wealth mean that many businesses owned by people of color are undercapitalized relative to white-owned businesses. Functionally, this means that even though almost as many people of color start businesses as do white people, rates of business ownership among people of color are far below the average because more than half of these businesses are unable to stay in business due to the lack of affordable financing. The pre-pandemic estimated capital gap for business owners of color in Massachusetts is at least $574 million a year. $574 million, reflecting the fact that this annual gap accrues over multiple years. Bridging that gap would require several billions of dollars. Naturally, the rates of unmet credit needs among entrepreneurs of color is 15 to 25% higher than those of white entrepreneurs. The Color of Capital Gap report by Boston Indicators identifies a state public bank as a valuable potential source of increased small business loans for entrepreneurs of color by collaborating with local funding institutions. And that's very, very important, by the way, that the public bank is not a competitor with our local banks, but a cooperator through participation loans. The public bank enables them to increase their reach and decrease their lending risk. The Boston Foundation has formally endorsed the creation of a Massachusetts public bank. So I'm just going to leave it at there because we want to get on to hearing from you. We will continue to be getting much good input from Nia and others at the Boston Ujima Project and from BECMA. Let me just say now that the legislation, that we have two bills and they're exactly the same. S665 was introduced by Senator Jamie Eldridge, and H1223 was introduced by Representatives Mike Connolly and Nika Elugardo. We had a hearing before the Joint Committee on Financial Services, and I just read some from our testimony, but we had an oral hearing last October and had a wide variety of speakers supporting the bills. And then our written testimony was submitted in late November, which is very detailed and heavily footnoted, showing how technically well-grounded the legislation is. And again, we have an extension to April 30th for the Joint Committee on Financial Services to decide the fate of the bill. Are they going to send it out of committee to the floor, or are they going to send it to study, which is a not very nice way of killing it for this legislative session? We want it out of committee. We want it to the floor. It would first go to the House and Ways and Means Committee and then to the floor. We want this fully debated and passed. So you can take action right now to support the bills. Our Action Network page should be up. Is it up on the screen now? Good. So you can just look at that. You can send a letter right now to your senator and representative. It's just one click away. So I hope you're taking a minute to do that right now. And now we're eager to hear your questions. Tracy Burns with Mothers Out Front will be our moderator. Thanks so much, Tracy. Take it away, and we're eager to hear from everybody.
Sure. So please put your questions in the chat. The Actioner link, I just tried it a minute ago and it wasn't working. So we'll try to get it to work. And if we can't get it to work, then in the RSVP, which we'll send you tomorrow, that thank you for attending, we'll include the link. And I did it last week. It's very quick. You put in your zip code and you get your state rep and you get your senator without working at it at all. There's a template for the letter, and you can edit it if you want to personalize it, and you click it. So if we can't get it to work tonight, please do it tomorrow. So in the meantime, I'll put your questions in the chat. And the first question, let's see, is from Pamela Kelly. How does the public bank expect to raise capital for the massive funding needed to transition to net zero greenhouse gas? I presume this will be done by loans. Thus far, the role has been taken by credit unions able to loan at 0% with subsidies by through Mass CEC.
Why don't we give this to Chris? Would you like to take that, or to Michael?
I'm happy to get started. I'm sure Michael will have things to say. So first thing to note is that this is actually a fairly small bank, so that it can't raise capital for the massive funding needed to transition to net zero greenhouse gases. I think that's the situation we're stuck with, is that we have to start small and prove that the public bank works well and can be an important contributor to modes of financing. So while I made the pitch that we have to use all the capacity we have, you know, that brings the public bank into the fold of other solutions, funding solutions. We'd love to see this pilot project prosper, prove itself. It seems to me actually, in all honesty, a no-brainer that one would use this kind of public capacity. And it would, the appropriations, I'm not quite sure how to read that language. The $200 million capital, which is this relatively small capitalization for the public bank, would actually be done by appropriation. So that will be appropriated by the legislature. And then that becomes, the legislature does not appropriate after that. That becomes the self-sustaining base, capital base, equity base for the bank, which then can lend, something like 1.5 billion on the basis of that capital. So it is lending, it's acting as a lender to support in all the ways we were talking about initiatives that will help us fight climate change and help us actually fight environmental or try to redress environmental injustice. I'll leave it to Michael to pick up on that. I'm sure he'll have more to say.
Yeah, Michael, if you want to pick up on that, and similar is, what would happen for borrowers if they default?
Well, that's a bad thing if they do. I want to go back to Chris's point to start, which is this is a small bank, and people are going to be disappointed if they think this is a panacea. Let me give an example of what would be practical for a bank like this, which is to say, to establish a partnership with a lender, say a credit union that's serving a lower moderate income community. And they can say to the credit union, look, we want you to originate solar loans, community solar and rooftop solar for individually owned homes. We'll be willing to lend you $5 million for 10 years at 1% interest. How many people would you be able to serve at that rate? And what they'd be able to say is, wow, that's really great if you could do that. Now, what the bank is doing is they would be underwriting the credit union in that case. They'd be saying, credit union, you're on the line. Now, you're still going to have to lend, but we're giving you 1% interest because we want you to figure out how to lend to people with a credit score of under 620. That's the criteria we're using. And we're going to lend you $5 million at 1% or even 0.5% in order to meet that target. So you'll still be able to charge a rate of 4 or 5%, which would be your standard rate, and be able to make some money doing that. Now, what we know from the data so far in lending is that solar loans, even to people with very low credit scores, perform very well, equivalent to credit scores to car lending for low credit scores. Those loans also perform very well. So what we're looking at here is partnerships. It's working with communities, working with community lenders, providing very flexible capital for them to serve populations that typically aren't served. But it's a series of working in different communities at the community level to bring affordable financing that certainly isn't available in most instances. But in terms of solving big problems like the one stated there, this isn't the institution that's going to be in a position to do that. This is going to solve problems at the community level in partnerships with credit unions, CDFIs, community banks, and provide the kind of flexible capital needed.
Thank you, Michael. So there's a question. I think I'm going to skip a few because I think Chris and Michael got at the core of them. And then there's a question about like who were the writers of this bill, and was it written by a diverse group of people? And how are we going to guarantee that low-income backgrounds have a seat at the board of the directors table?
Okay, I could say a few words about that. First of all, to clarify that this bill is written with the intention of getting it passed, not just in terms of getting an A #1 from the progressive community. And the board of directors is made up primarily of people with a financial background, because they need to know about banking in order to serve as a board. But the Board of Advisors is where the community representation comes in. And I will tell you that some of us who were involved in writing this bill spent a huge amount of time talking about the Board of Advisors, who should be on it, what is their role, and how we make sure that the Board of Advisors not only has a voice in looking at the business plan and commenting on the business plan, but also that there's a portal that's available to all residents of the state to read the business plan, comment on it, talk about what their concerns are. And it's the responsibility of the Board of Advisors to get this feedback to the CEO and the Board of Directors. So even though the community representatives aren't on the Board of Directors, we've really worked very hard to make sure that the people's voice is heard in the bank. Okay.
I would
maybe-
also add, Ruth, you may know more of the history all the way back, but I actually came into this movement a little before Ruth returned to Massachusetts in about 2018 at the tail end of Mel King's involvement in it. It was Mel King in about 2016, as I recall, pushed a group of activists who had been working for a long time at a lower level on the bill, on a bill. They hadn't fleshed out really the attributes of the bill. And Mel King then got a protege of his named Charles Grigsby, whom we all adored, who was a very experienced community development finance expert from the city of Boston, and really a close colleague of Mel King's involved. And when I first started going to the group, it was held downtown in the Mel King, I forgot what it's called, the Technology Center or something. And those two people attended. Chuck Grigsby remained vigorously involved in the bill, and his insight was that we had to work really hard not to compete with the commercial banks. And so at the beginning, for a couple of years, the bill's character was shaped by that insight, and was really a funding mechanism to reach cities and towns, to make safe infrastructure, to make things like education, health, some other, sort of at the discretion of the municipalities. And when COVID hit, and Chuck was still with us, he has since died, unfortunately, that at that point, the group itself realized that the needs were so much greater than infrastructure for urban areas, and were so widespread across the state that that we expanded it, both for reasons of racial justice and because of the way businesses were being hit disproportionately in underserved communities. And the climate needs were becoming ever more pressing, with what looked like maybe less money to reach them. So at that point, BECMA got involved, Black Economic Council of Massachusetts, and Ujima got involved. And as Nia Evans taught us, Ujima actually, its founding was based on commitment to a public bank. So she brought this kind of expertise that really was very ground level into the movement. And it was that winter of, I guess it was 2020, the end of 20 and the beginning of 21, when all of us together wrote the bill. So it's been a very collective effort, very diverse across those communities, and really informed by a great sort of breadth of concern, with all of these different actors responding to needs that they were seeing in their communities.
Yeah, I'd just like to add, Nia Evans is absolutely a key person in this whole effort. I'm sorry she had a conflict tonight and couldn't be on the call, but as the executive director of Ujima and all the good work that Ujima does in financing for Black enterprises, she's just absolutely key. And also BECMA, San Gabru, who is our consultant, comes from BECMA. And he was their main policy director before he went into consulting. So our ties with the Black activist community is just very, very strong, and we're very beholden to them, frankly.
I have another question. So someone made a comment that part of the process of getting a bill passed is really educating the legislatures on how the financial world works. Is that true? Would you agree with that? And if that is true, then how do you get that done?
To be honest, I think the bandwidth of many legislators is not one that would really have them taking the time to do a deep dive into how the whole financial system works. We find that even with some of the key people we need to reach, we have to keep things not too complicated. Sometimes we think that somebody who's in a key position has read the testimony. No, they've not read the testimony. And so we have to present it in a way that, they're busy. They're very busy. They have a lot of responsibilities. And so we have to be mindful of that and try and present it in ways that they get it easily.
Okay.
I would add that the way banks work is obscure to almost everybody. It's not just the legislators, it's all of us. And it's not obvious. Once you actually take apart a bank, you can see how it works, and you can realize that there's enormous capacity there. And that capacity has, as I might have mentioned, but I should, has been used by the public before in many occasions in, earlier periods of American history, and that there's every reason we should use it again. But that kind of learning is something that's not very common. So it's not just the legislators, but we've had I would say we've spent the last year probably going around talking to people, trying to explain how banks work and why this is a relatively obvious strategy that we really should try.
Yeah. So there's a lot of chatter about the Massachusetts Green Bank and how that's the same as the public bank and how it's different.
I'll start and then other people can jump in. Because I know when I was in DC, we were promoting the public bank, and there was also a green bank bill. And I think someone on the call is very involved with the green bank. So I'll just say that even though it's called a green bank, it's not a bank in the sense that we think of, or it's not really a bank. It's an investment fund, not a bank. So I'm going to let other people, and I see Nadav has just jumped on the call. Nadav, welcome. Nadav has been a key person along with Chris and others in our work. Nadav, maybe you'd like to jump in on that question.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that the emphasis is on green bank is a little bit of a misnomer insofar as we use the term bank to refer to entities with an actual banking charter. And the key benefit of a banking charter is that it allows those who hold it to raise their finance through deposits. And that is very beneficial because deposits are a very, very cheap source of funds. Then that cheap source of funds could then be passed on to borrowers from the bank. That's not the case with that's really not the case with green banks. So green banks are typically entities that are funded primarily either out of an appropriation or a lot of times from a special fee by ratepayers. And in some sense, they're a little bit like the opposite of banks. They take high risk positions, typically subordinated positions. So they would take the very riskiest position in a project in order to make it happen. So it's just a completely different philosophy from the public bank, and they're both valuable and important, and you don't have to choose between one or the other. You can have you can mix and match, you can have both. They're both beneficial for different types of financial needs. But one approach, the public bank approach in our case, is get a very small a relatively small appropriation, very abundant, cheap finance, and then pass on that benefit to the borrowers that are eligible to borrow from the public bank. That's the public banking approach. Relatively low risk projects. The green bank approach is have an appropriation or amounts that are deducted from ratepayers and make a pool of capital that has a very high degree of risk appetite. And that's why it can make a difference. So we could never combine, we could never combine these two features. They would be incongruent. So we should have two different entities engaging in these two different lines.
Thank you. And I do believe Chris said it's really complicated. So I'm going to pivot to, and I think an interesting question is like regarding whose name is on the bill, and if they were significant contributors, why is Nia Evans and the Black Economic Development Groups, why are their names not on the bill?
So on the legislation, you have legislators on the bill. And so Senator Jamie Eldridge and Representative Nika Elgardo and Mike Connolly, they're members of the state legislature. I'm not a member of the state legislature, so my name can't be on the bill. And I just wanted to go back to a little bit of Chris's history, because Nika Elgardo was really inspired by the early work on the public bank and in getting involved. So there's a lot of positive feedback between the activist public interest community and the more progressive legislators. And I'm sure other people on this call, are probably involved in other campaigns and know how this can work.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so I'm trying to look at the chat and think I got most of them. If anyone has more questions, either put it in the chat or if you can, you raise your hand. You're welcome to unmute yourself. We have a few more minutes. But tell me, has everyone been able to successfully access the link? Because I know it was not working, but now it is working. So again, do it now. It takes half a minute or 2 minutes. We'd really love you to do it and contact your Senate, your legislatures. And again, if you can't do it now because you don't know, you can't manage 2 screens, you will get it in the thank you note tomorrow, and as well as the recording. There's a few people who RSVP'd for tonight's event and aren't able to get on, so they, in a letter tomorrow, they'll get the recording and the link to that action. Okay, so let's see, Nancy, there is a question. Oh yeah, so there's been a question. Is this being set up as a pilot and it's going to scale up, or will this, once it's fully funded, does it maintain its same size?
Well, let me try and answer that, and Chris, you might want to jump in as well. Right now it's set up as it's not called a pilot. It will be a real bank and will function as a bank, and we've done some work, and Nadav has done some work on it as well, to develop a financial model for the bank to, make some assumptions and see if it will grow. One way it can grow is that if the bank is effective, the legislature can appropriate more capital, which will leverage more deposits and make the bank bigger. The other way the bank can grow, which is what happened in North Dakota over a number of years. So we can check back, we can have another Zoom call in 100 years and check back and see how much the bank has grown in that time through retained earnings. And, we've played around with the model to say, there's a trade-off. Do we want the bank in some instances to make money on certain loans, and on other loans provide clearly a subsidy? And I think it's an important question to ask, because there are really two issues at hand here. One is cost of capital, and the other is access to capital. And in many instances, what Massachusetts communities suffer from is lack of access to capital. That is, they would be happy to pay market rates. Small businesses would be happy to pay market rates if they could even get loans. And so the issue isn't to subsidize the cost of capital, it's to make it available at the cost it is to any other borrower. So it is possible that the managers of the bank can say, one of the things we want to do is grow. And so we're only going to subsidize those loans where the subsidy is necessary to make the underlying program work, to reach the people and the communities that we want to work. There's a lot of balancing that has to go on here. Which is a long way of saying, yes, the bank can and should grow over time. How quickly it grows is really dependent on some of these difficult decisions the managers of the bank will have to make.
I think there's also a political calculation here, and that is that we're saying it's only going to cost the state the $200 million for capitalization, 50 million over 4 years. So for us to add to the messaging today that, oh yeah, it could grow more in the future, sort of muddies that message. If after 4 years, this bank is successful, the state legislature is going to be dying to give us more capital to grow the bank. But we don't say that right up front. That's sort of the strategy.
Okay, so we have somewhere but under 60 seconds. So I think I'm just going to pass this back to you, Ruth, to say goodnight to everyone.
Well, I just want to thank everyone for joining this call. And again, reminder that next week is Public Banking Week. So we really want to use next week to spread the word wide and far for people to contact their legislators. And again, of course, the bill numbers are S665 and H1223. And, I hope a lot of you have been able to use the link in the chat to send out your messages. So if you haven't yet, just take a moment right now and fill out the form. And I just want to say thank you to everyone who was on the call, and especially a shout out of thanks to Chris and to Michael Swack and to Nadav, who came in from Colorado to be on the call. Thanks. Also, Tracy, thank you. And thanks to Mothers Out Front, and thanks to Sierra Club for partnering on this. This is the kind of partnering we need to really make this bank a reality. So again, thank you, and let's keep going.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.